If a machine starts whispering before sunrise, you either listen to it or you prepare to lose millions by lunch. I said that once to a new supervisor years ago after a pressure valve failed on line 4. He laughed at the time. 3 hours later, the entire production floor shut down. That was the thing about factory systems. They always warned you before they broke. The problem was that most executives stopped learning how to hear the warnings a long time ago. The morning everything started unraveling, I arrived at the plant in Akron, Ohio at 4:45 like I had for nearly 17 years. The parking lot was still dark except for the pale orange glow from the loading docks and the endless rows of pickup trucks belonging to night shift workers. Inside the building, the air smelled like machine oil, hot metal, and industrial cleaner strong enough to sting the back of your throat before your coffee even kicked in. Some people hated factory life. I never did. Machines made more sense to me than executives ever had. I walked across the production floor past line 2 and line 5, while conveyor belts hummed steadily under fluorescent lights. Workers nodded as I passed. Most of them did not fully understand what calibration actually involved, but they understood one thing clearly. When I said something sounded wrong, they paid attention. At exactly 5:12 that morning, I stopped walking beside line 7. The sound almost disappeared beneath the rest of the machinery if you were not listening carefully. A faint metallic hesitation buried inside the motor rhythm every 14 seconds. Most people would never notice it. But after 17 years, I could hear a pressure imbalance before the sensors caught it officially. I stepped toward the control panel and checked the live measurements. Alignment variance: 0.04 inches. Tiny. Technically still inside acceptable range. But not for medical equipment manufacturing. Not when those parts were headed into surgical monitoring systems shipped to hospitals across the country. I adjusted my glasses and watched the calibration trendline flicker again. There it was. Drift. Slow enough to hide during routine inspections but dangerous once production volume increased later in the shift. "Morning, Laura." The plant manager called from behind me while carrying a tablet and travel mug. "You look like somebody just died." I kept my eyes on the panel. "Line 7 is drifting again," I said calmly. "Pressure sequence is lagging inside the secondary alignment cycle." He barely looked at the screen before shrugging. "The new automation software corrected that issue last month." There it was. The sentence I had started hearing more often ever since corporate installed the new efficiency systems from Columbus. Executives loved dashboards because dashboards made them feel smarter than experience. "The software is correcting symptoms," I replied quietly. "Not the source." The plant manager sighed the way people do when they think they are being patient with outdated employees. "Laura, we spent $6 million upgrading this facility. Trust the system." I almost smiled at that because he still did not understand the difference between software and stability. Systems do not stay stable because computers say they are stable. They stay stable because someone notices the tiny things before they become expensive disasters. I ran another manual calibration check anyway. The variance flickered again. Slightly worse this time. A younger technician walked past carrying a clipboard and glanced at the warning indicator. "It is still green," he said casually. "Barely," I answered. Nobody responded after that. Production schedules mattered more than instincts inside modern factories. By 7:30 the morning meeting had already started in the glass conference room overlooking the floor. Efficiency targets. Shipping deadlines. Corporate modernization initiatives. Nobody mentioned line 7 except me. I explained the drift pattern carefully while charts glowed across the presentation screen. The plant manager leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "You are relying too much on old-school judgment calls," he said. "The software predicts stability at 98.7%. Around the table, younger supervisors nodded without really understanding what they were agreeing to. I looked through the glass wall toward line 7 moving steadily below us under bright factory lights. "Machines do not care about prediction models," I said quietly. "They care about alignment." The room fell silent for half a second before the plant manager closed his tablet. "We are moving forward with the current production schedule," he announced. Then he looked directly at me. "And beginning today, calibration overrides will require management approval first." I felt something cold settle into my stomach then. Not fear. Recognition. because suddenly I understood they were not trying to protect the system anymore. They were trying to protect the appearance that the system could run without people like me. By lunchtime, my calibration access had been removed. The first thing I noticed after losing my calibration access was how loud the factory suddenly sounded. Not because the machines changed, but because I could no longer quiet the problems before they spread. For 17 years, every shift started with me walking the lines before production volume peaked. Listening, watching, catching tiny drifts before the system even recognized them officially. Most people thought calibration meant typing numbers into software. They did not understand half the job was instinct built from years of hearing when a machine was lying about its own stability. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, my security badge no longer opened the calibration control stations on the floor. The younger technicians kept glancing at me awkwardly while pretending not to. Word travels fast inside factories. Faster than corporate emails. I spent the next 2 hours documenting every unresolved variance I could still legally access from archived maintenance logs. Line 7 pressure drift. Secondary alignment lag. Sensor delay across the overnight production cycle. I printed hard copies because I had watched too many corporate systems accidentally lose uncomfortable records over the years. Around 3:15, Human Resources called me upstairs. The conference room overlooked the factory floor through thick glass walls, while forklifts moved below carrying stainless steel containers. Between production zones, everything down there still looked normal, clean, efficient, stable. That was the dangerous part about industrial systems. Collapse rarely announces itself dramatically at first. It begins quietly inside tiny ignored inconsistencies executives decide are acceptable, because production quotas matter more than caution. The human resources representative smiled at me with the same rehearsed sympathy I had seen during dozens of layoffs over the years. Beside her sat the plant manager and a younger corporate efficiency director from Columbus wearing polished shoes that had probably never touched an actual production floor for more than 10 minutes at a time. "Laura," the efficiency director began smoothly, "the company is moving toward a more automation-centered operational model." Automation-centered. Corporate language always sounds cleanest right before people lose their livelihoods. I sat quietly while he continued talking about modernization initiatives, streamlined oversight, and reduced dependency on legacy calibration practices. Legacy practices. Funny phrase for 17 years of keeping hospital equipment production stable enough to pass federal inspection. The new predictive systems eliminate the need for manual intervention at your previous level, he explained. We believe the facility is ready for a more scalable future. I almost asked him if he knew the difference between predictive stability and mechanical stability, but I already understood this meeting was not about understanding anything. It was about cost reduction disguised as innovation. The plant manager finally spoke without meeting my eyes directly. "We appreciate your years here, Laura." Years here. Not expertise. Not experience. Just years. I looked through the conference room glass toward line 7 moving steadily beneath fluorescent lights below us. The warning indicator remained green, but I could already hear the hesitation in the motor rhythm from up there even through the thick windows. Every 14 seconds. Slight drag. Slight recovery. Pressure compensating too aggressively during secondary alignment. "Line 7 is still drifting," I said calmly. The efficiency director sighed softly. "The software disagrees." There it was again. Faith in dashboards over reality. "Software does not hear bearing stress," I replied quietly. Nobody answered immediately after that. The human resources representative slid a folder toward me containing severance documents and insurance continuation forms. 17 years condensed into paperwork in legal language. I signed nothing. Instead, I stood slowly and picked up the folder without opening it. Before leaving, I looked directly at the plant manager one last time. "Do not override line 7 if the warning shifts yellow," I said. He gave a short smile like I had offered superstition instead of technical advice. "We will manage," he replied. I nodded once and walked out of the room without another word because deep down I already knew something they did not. Machines always tell the truth eventually, even when management decides not to listen. I carried my box through the production floor myself because I refused to let management escort me out like some kind of security risk. Workers glanced up from the assembly lines as I passed, their expressions shifting from confusion to quiet understanding one by one. Nobody said much out loud. Factory people rarely do when something serious happens. But I noticed the way several operators stopped what they were doing to watch me walk past line 7 for the last time. The younger technician replacing me stood near the calibration station holding a brand new tablet, issued by corporate automation. He looked nervous beneath the fluorescent lights, though he tried hard to hide it. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Laura," he called awkwardly as I reached the end of the line. "The system keeps asking for manual alignment confirmation on the secondary cycle." I stopped walking slowly. Behind him, the machines continued humming through another production run while robotic arms shifted polished medical components along the conveyor under bright white inspection lights. Everything still looked stable from a distance. That was the dangerous thing about industrial drift. Catastrophe usually begins while everything still appears functional. "Do not clear the warning manually," I said quietly. "If the secondary cycle starts compensating faster than the pressure sensors can stabilize, the entire alignment chain will begin chasing itself." He blinked at me for a second like he understood individual words but not the reality underneath them. Then he gave a quick smile. "Corporate says the new predictive software autocorrects pressure imbalance now." Corporate says. I had heard that phrase more times in the last 6 months than during the previous 16 years combined. "Pressure and alignment are not the same thing," I replied calmly. "The software only sees numbers. It does not hear mechanical stress building inside the bearings." Before he could answer, the plant manager appeared behind him carrying another travel mug, and wearing the same relaxed confidence executives always have right before systems fail publicly. "Laura," he said, "we have it handled." I nodded once because there was no point arguing anymore. Machines do not negotiate with management optimism. They only obey physics. I turned and kept walking toward the exit while forklifts moved steadily across the loading zone beside me carrying sealed crates marked for hospital shipment. 17 years. Thousands of overnight recalibrations. Hundreds of emergency corrections nobody upstairs ever noticed because I prevented problems before production stopped long enough to cost money. Most executives only understand maintenance after it disappears. Outside, cold Ohio wind hit my face the moment the factory doors closed behind me. The parking lot looked almost silver beneath heavy cloud cover, while diesel trucks idled near the shipping docks waiting for afternoon loads. I placed my cardboard box carefully in the passenger seat of my truck, and sat there for a moment without starting the engine. Then my phone buzzed. A message from one of the overnight operators still inside the plant. Only 6 words. "Line 7 just shifted yellow." I stared at the screen while distant factory alarms echoed faintly through the loading yard. Yellow warning status meant the drift was accelerating faster than the system could compensate comfortably. Not failure yet, but close enough that experienced calibrators stopped trusting automation alone. I typed back immediately. "Do not override secondary alignment." 3 dots appeared while he responded, then disappeared. Then finally returned with one short sentence that made my stomach tighten instantly. "Management already reset it twice." I looked back toward the massive factory stretching across the gray Ohio skyline, while steam drifted from rooftop vents into the freezing afternoon air. Somewhere inside that building, executives still believed they were controlling the situation because the dashboard remained mostly green. But dashboards only show symptoms after systems have already started breaking underneath them. And deep down I think part of me already knew the shutdown had begun. At 2:13 the next morning, the first production batch failed inspection. I know the exact time because one of the overnight operators called me from the parking lot during his smoke break with panic buried underneath his voice. "The alignment readings keep bouncing," he said quietly while wind howled through the phone speaker behind him. "They reset the warning again, but now the inspection lasers are rejecting entire trays." I sat up slowly in bed staring into darkness while cold rain tapped against the windows of my small house outside Akron. For 17 years, my body had been trained to wake instantly when factory workers called after midnight. Most emergencies inside production plants begin during overnight shifts, when exhausted supervisors start trusting software more than instinct. "Which line?" I asked even though I already knew the answer. 7, he replied immediately. Of course. I rubbed one hand across my face and listened carefully while he described the symptoms. pressure compensation spikes, alignment delays, sensor recalibration loops triggering every 6 minutes instead of every 30. The system was chasing itself now exactly the way I warned them it would once they started manually overriding drift protection. Did they slow production speed? I asked. Silence. Then a short laugh without humor. Corporate ordered output increases tonight because shipments are already behind. There it was. The real reason management ignored the warnings. Production pressure. Hospital contracts. Quarterly numbers. Executives always gamble with stability when deadlines start threatening bonuses. I closed my eyes briefly while imagining Line 7 running too fast beneath bright factory lights. Robotic arms compensating aggressively while microscopic alignment errors multiplied inside equipment designed for surgical monitoring systems. Tiny mistakes become catastrophic quickly inside medical manufacturing. Listen to me carefully, I said quietly. If the warning shifts red, tell them not to override the shutdown sequence. Another silence. Longer this time. Then he exhaled slowly. Laura. They already disabled part of the auto-stop threshold an hour ago. I sat perfectly still after hearing that, because suddenly this was no longer about calibration drift. It was about leadership panicking hard enough to silence safety systems themselves. Outside my house, rain rattled harder against the roof while freight trains groaned faintly somewhere beyond the highway. I remembered all the times executives complained that I was too cautious, too resistant to modernization, too dependent on manual intuition. But intuition was never magic. It was pattern recognition built from surviving problems before other people even understood they existed. Around 4:30 that morning, another message arrived from inside the plant. A photograph this time. 3 warning indicators glowing yellow across separate production lines instead of just one. That meant the calibration instability had spread through shared pressure synchronization. Exactly what happens when systems compensate too aggressively trying to correct hidden drift. By sunrise, the factory floor looked different from the pictures workers started quietly sending each other. Operators standing beside idle conveyors with crossed arms. Supervisors arguing near control stations. Crates of rejected components stacked near quality inspection. Nobody smiling anymore. The younger technician replacing me sent one message at 7:12 in the morning. I think the software is fighting the machines. Stared at the screen for several seconds before typing back only one sentence. The software is following instructions. The machines are following physics. Then I set my phone down and walked toward the kitchen window, while gray Ohio dawn spread slowly across wet fields outside. Somewhere inside that factory, executives were probably still staring at dashboards hoping enough green indicators remained to convince themselves the situation was manageable. But factory systems do not collapse all at once. First they whisper. Then they drift. Then eventually every machine in the building starts speaking the same language at the same time. And by then nobody can pretend not to hear it anymore. The factory shutdown began at 8:41 on Saturday morning. Not all at once. Industrial systems almost never fail dramatically in a single moment like movies pretend they do. First one conveyor slowed unexpectedly on line 3. Then pressure synchronization dropped across secondary assembly. Then the inspection laser started rejecting components faster than operators could clear them from the belts. Within 20 minutes, every production supervisor inside the building was talking over each other through radio headsets, while alarms pulsed softly beneath the constant mechanical noise. I know because one of the floor operators kept calling me between station resets, his breathing tighter each time. They cannot stabilize the torque calibration, he said while machinery alarms echoed behind him. Every correction makes another line drift worse. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone while gray Ohio rain blurred across the fields outside my house. 17 years inside manufacturing teaches you exactly how systems behave before collapse. Once multiple lines begin compensating against each other, stability stops being local. It becomes contagious. Did they restore the shutdown thresholds? I asked immediately. Silence answered me for 2 seconds too long. No, he admitted quietly. Corporate wants production running until the hospital shipment leaves tonight. Of course they did. Because somewhere inside a clean conference room far away from the production floor, executives were probably staring at delivery contracts and penalty clauses instead of listening to the machines screaming underneath them. Around 9:15, another worker sent me a short video from inside the plant. Operators standing beside stalled conveyor belts while yellow warning lights flashed overhead in slow intervals. The younger technician replacing me was kneeling beside a calibration panel with 3 maintenance manuals spread open across the floor around him. His hands were shaking slightly, while he tried resetting pressure compensation sequences manually. I recognized the expression on his face immediately. Not incompetence. Panic. Because nobody told him the truth before they handed him my job. Calibration is not memorizing procedures. It is understanding how thousands of tiny mechanical behaviors interact under stress. By 10 o'clock, the software vendor itself joined the emergency call with management. One of the engineers finally said what I already knew they would eventually admit. The predictive system is functioning correctly, he explained. The instability appears to originate from unresolved physical calibration drift inside the production architecture. Physical drift. In other words, the machines themselves no longer trusted the alignment data they were receiving. I sat quietly at my kitchen table listening through speakerphone while someone inside the factory accidentally left me connected to the group call longer than they realized. The plant manager sounded different now. Less confident. Faster. Can we bypass the secondary compensation cycle completely? He asked. The vendor engineer answered immediately. If you do that, the auto protection system may trigger a full facility shutdown. Another silence followed. Then someone from corporate spoke for the first time. How much production do we lose per hour if that happens? There it was. The question executives always ask first once systems begin collapsing. Not is it safe? Not why did this happen? Just numbers. Cost. Delay exposure. Shipment penalties. Around 11:27, the answer arrived for them anyway. One by one, the production lines started locking themselves into protective halt mode after detecting unrecoverable calibration instability. Conveyor belts slowed. Robotic arms froze mid-cycle. Warning lights shifted from yellow to solid red across the facility. Then the entire plant finally went silent. No grinding motors. No hydraulic pulses. No conveyor vibration beneath the concrete floors. Just alarms echoing softly through a building no longer capable of pretending everything was under control. The operator still on the phone with me whispered something then that stayed with me long after the line disconnected. Laura, he said quietly, I have worked here 12 years, and I have never heard the factory this quiet before. By noon, corporate executives from Columbus had already arrived at the plant wearing polished shoes and expensive winter coats completely unsuited for a production floor that still smelled like overheated motors and emergency shutdown coolant. I watched part of it unfold through text messages and photos workers kept sending me quietly throughout the afternoon. Executives standing stiffly beneath flashing warning lights while operators explained the same problems over and over again, using simpler words each time. Nobody listens carefully to factory workers until millions of dollars stop moving. The plant manager looked exhausted in every picture. His tie loosened. His face pale beneath fluorescent lights. The same man who told me to trust the software now stood surrounded by frozen conveyor belts and silent robotic arms, while hospital shipment deadlines collapsed hour by hour. Around 1:30, one of the operators called me again, while hiding near the loading docks during break. Wind roared through the speaker hard enough to distort parts of his voice. Corporate keeps asking for restart estimates, he said quietly. Nobody can give them one. I leaned against my kitchen counter staring at rain sliding slowly down the windows. Because they do not understand the actual failure yet, I replied. The lines are not malfunctioning independently anymore. The synchronization architecture collapsed. Silence. Then he laughed softly under his breath. You sound calmer than everyone inside this building. Right now. Maybe I was. Because panic only surprises people who ignored the warning signs earlier. Around 3 o'clock, another message arrived containing photographs from the emergency executive meeting upstairs. The conference room overlooking the factory floor was full now. Corporate operations directors, legal representatives, vendor engineers. Men who probably had not stepped inside a working production facility in years, suddenly arguing beside giant screens filled with red system alerts. But what caught my attention most was the table itself. Spread across it were printed copies of my old calibration logs and handwritten maintenance notes. 17 years of records executives used to call outdated. Now they were studying every page like survival instructions. One image showed the younger technician sitting alone near the back wall with both hands pressed against his forehead, while executives argued around him. I felt something close to sympathy then. Not because he replaced me, but because management threw him into a system they never respected enough to understand properly themselves. At 4:17, my phone finally rang from a number I recognized immediately. The plant manager. I let it ring twice before answering. For a second neither of us spoke. Behind him I could hear muffled alarms and distant machinery fans still cycling through shutdown protocols somewhere inside the building. "Laura," he said carefully, his voice lower than I had ever heard it before. "We need help stabilizing the lines." Not an apology. Not yet. Just reality finally forcing honesty into the conversation. I walked slowly toward the kitchen window while gray Ohio clouds hung low above frozen farmland outside. "Did you restore the shutdown thresholds?" I asked first. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "About an hour ago." "Good. At least someone inside that building finally stopped fighting the safety systems. The vendor engineers cannot isolate the drift," he continued. "Every recalibration attempt spreads instability to another line." I closed my eyes briefly because that confirmed exactly what I already suspected. The factory was no longer dealing with a software issue. It was dealing with cascading mechanical memory corruption caused by weeks of ignored calibration stress. The machines had spent too long compensating against false stability data. "You removed the only person tracking the pressure behavior manually," I said calmly. Another silence followed. Longer this time. Then finally, the sentence management always waits too long to say. "Can you come back to the plant?" I did not answer the plant manager immediately. I stood beside the kitchen window watching freezing rain sweep across empty Ohio fields, while his breathing crackled softly through the phone line. Somewhere behind him inside the factory, alarms still pulsed through silent production halls that were never supposed to stop running. 17 years earlier, when I first walked into that plant as a calibration technician, one of the older mechanics told me something I never forgot. "Factories are like living things," he said. "If you ignore small pain long enough, eventually the whole body stops moving." Back then I thought he was being dramatic. Now corporate executives were learning the same lesson the expensive way. "I am not coming back as an employee," I said finally. Silence answered me immediately. Then the plant manager cleared his throat carefully. "Laura, this is an emergency."
"No," he replied calmly.
"This is the result of treating experience like overhead cost." The rain hit harder against the windows while I listened to muffled voices arguing somewhere near him on the production floor. He sounded exhausted now, stripped of the easy confidence he wore during meetings upstairs in the glass conference room. "Corporate-approved emergency consultant authorization," he said quickly. "Whatever rate you want." Funny how quickly companies rediscover expertise after systems stop functioning. I closed my eyes briefly before answering. "I want full authority over calibration decisions while I am inside that building," I said. "No management overrides. No production pressure arguments. And if I say the lines stay down, they stay down." Another pause followed. Longer this time. Then quietly, "Agreed." I arrived at the plant 40 minutes later wearing my old Navy work jacket instead of a company uniform. The parking lot looked different now. Emergency maintenance trucks lined the loading docks while executives in dark winter coats hurried between entrances carrying tablets and phones. Nobody stopped me at the security gate this time. In fact, the guard opened the barrier before I even rolled down my window completely. Inside the facility, the silence felt wrong immediately. Factories are supposed to vibrate. Conveyor belts. Hydraulic pulses. Cooling fans. Forklift traffic. But now the production floor stood frozen beneath harsh fluorescent lights while operators clustered near idle machinery speaking in low voices. Some looked relieved when they saw me walk in. Others looked embarrassed. The younger technician who replaced me stood beside line 7, holding a stack of printed calibration logs against his chest. He looked like he had not slept in 24 hours. "Laura," he said quietly as I approached. "I am sorry." I nodded once because I knew the apology was genuine. He was never the problem. The problem was leadership convincing themselves software could replace understanding. I walked straight toward the Line 7 control station, while executives followed several steps behind me like nervous tourists entering dangerous territory. The plant manager started explaining everything they had tried during the shutdown, but I raised one hand gently before he finished. "Stop talking for a minute," I said. Then I closed my eyes beside the machine and listened. Just listened. The production floor remained silent except for cooling systems ticking softly inside dormant equipment. Around us, executives exchanged confused glances while operators watched carefully from nearby stations. Then I heard it. A faint pressure release cycling unevenly inside the secondary synchronization chamber, every 13 seconds instead of 14. Tiny. Almost invisible. But enough to destabilize every compensation sequence connected to it. I opened my eyes and looked directly at the younger technician, who changed the secondary timing interval. His face drained of color instantly. Then one of the corporate engineers answered quietly from behind. "Me." The automation patch shortened the cycle to increase throughput efficiency. There it was. The entire disaster compressed into one executive decision. They optimized speed without understanding the rhythm the machines needed to stay stable. I looked back at the frozen production line stretching across the factory floor beneath white industrial lights. Then I spoke the sentence that finally made the room go silent. The software was never the expert. The room stayed silent for several seconds after I said it. Not defensive silence. Not argumentative silence. The kind people fall into when reality finally arrives before they are emotionally prepared for it. Around us, the factory floor remained frozen beneath rows of harsh white industrial lights, while warning indicators pulsed softly across idle production lines. The corporate engineers stared at the control panel screens, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less expensive if they waited long enough. But machines do not negotiate with denial. I stepped closer to the Line 7 synchronization panel and opened the secondary timing diagnostics manually. There it was immediately. The automation patch had shortened the compensation cycle by less than 1 second to increase throughput efficiency across overnight production. Tiny adjustment. Catastrophic consequence. You accelerated the correction rhythm without recalibrating the bearing response intervals, I said calmly while scanning the system logs. One of the vendor engineers frowned. The predictive model projected stable compensation behavior. Because the predictive model assumed ideal mechanical conditions, I replied. Factories do not operate under ideal conditions after 17 years of wear. Nobody answered that because everyone inside the room finally understood the same thing at once. The software had not failed. Leadership failed by believing optimization mattered more than mechanical reality. I crouched beside the lower calibration housing and listened carefully again, while operators gathered quietly nearby watching every movement. Then I pointed toward the secondary pressure regulator. The line spent too long overcompensating against false stability data, I explained. Now every connected system is correcting itself too aggressively. The younger technician stepped closer holding his tablet tightly. "Can we stabilize it?" he asked. I looked at him for a moment before nodding once. "Yes, but not fast." That answer visibly disappointed the executives standing behind us because corporate people always expect problems to disappear immediately once the smartest person enters the room. They do not understand that systems damaged slowly must also heal slowly. Shut down all synchronization sharing between lines 3 through 7. I instructed. Restore the original 14-second compensation interval. Then reduce overnight throughput targets by 20% for the next 72 hours. One executive from Columbus immediately objected. That production reduction will destroy delivery schedules. I turned toward him calmly. Your delivery schedules already collapsed yesterday. Silence again. Operators nearby lowered their eyes slightly, trying not to react. Deep down, factory workers usually know the truth long before executives admit it publicly. For the next 3 hours, the production floor slowly came back to life, one system at a time. Not dramatically. Carefully. I walked line by line beside technicians restoring pressure sequences manually while maintenance crews reset bearing tolerances and inspection sensors under my supervision. The younger technician stayed beside me almost the entire afternoon carrying logs and asking questions quietly instead of pretending to know everything now. Good. That meant he might survive this industry after all. Around 6:30 that evening, Line 7 finally restarted successfully. Conveyor belts moved cautiously beneath bright inspection lights while robotic arms resumed synchronized motion without the violent correction spikes from earlier. Operators across the floor actually applauded softly when the warning indicators shifted from red back to green. Not because the factory was fully stable again yet, but because the building no longer sounded sick. The plant manager approached me near the control station while forklifts slowly resumed movement across the loading zone behind us. He looked older than he had 2 days earlier. "You fixed it," he said quietly. I shook my head once while watching the line cycle carefully through another successful alignment sequence.
No, irraplia.
I stopped it from getting worse. Then I looked back across the massive production floor stretching beneath fluorescent lights and slowly waking back up around us. The system was protecting itself the entire time, I said. You were the ones fighting it. The factory sounded alive again by Monday morning. Not perfect, not fully stable yet, but alive. Conveyor belts moved with steady rhythm beneath fluorescent lights while forklifts rolled carefully between loading zones carrying delayed hospital shipments that corporate executives had spent the entire weekend praying would not be canceled permanently. I arrived just before dawn wearing the same navy work jacket from Saturday, only this time nobody looked at me like outdated overhead walking through the building. Operators nodded differently now. Maintenance crews stepped aside automatically when I approached calibration stations. Even the executives from Columbus stopped talking whenever I leaned close to a machine to listen. Funny how quickly respect appears once systems stop functioning without you. The younger technician met me beside Line 7 carrying fresh inspection reports and a coffee he clearly bought too quickly because the lid was barely attached correctly. All overnight batches passed, he said carefully while handing me the reports. His voice sounded steadier than it had 2 days earlier. Good. Pressure either destroys people or teaches them how to pay attention. Sometimes both. I reviewed the calibration logs slowly, while the line cycled through another production sequence beside us. 14-second compensation intervals restored. Bearing temperature stable. Pressure synchronization finally behaving like a machine instead of a frightened animal trying to outrun itself. Across the floor, operators had started calling Line 7 Laura's line. Again, even though management pretended not to hear it. Around 8:30 the plant manager asked me upstairs to the same glass conference room where they terminated me 4 days earlier. The room looked different now somehow. Less confident. The executives sitting around the table no longer spoke like people. Certain dashboards understood reality better than workers did. Corporate panic has a way of making conference rooms more honest. The efficiency director from Columbus cleared his throat before speaking. Laura, he began carefully, the company would like to discuss bringing you back permanently in a senior operations leadership role. There it was. The offer they always make after disaster forces humility into the room. Bigger salary. Better title. Suddenly the same experience they called outdated had become critical infrastructure overnight. I looked through the conference room glass toward the production floor below where Line 7 moved steadily beneath bright industrial lights. 17 years of my life lived inside that building. Birthdays missed. Overnight emergencies solved. Holiday shutdowns canceled because systems needed stabilizing before Monday shipments. For a long time, I thought loyalty meant sacrificing quietly until companies finally noticed your value. But factories teach hard lessons eventually. Machines only survive when pressure stays balanced. People are not much different. I appreciate the offer, I said calmly. But I am not coming back as an employee. The plant manager lowered his eyes briefly like he already expected that answer before the meeting even started. Then what do you want? He asked quietly. I almost smiled at that because for the first time since this entire disaster started, nobody in the room was talking about software anymore. Nobody mentioned automation dashboards or modernization initiatives. They were finally asking the right question. I placed my calibration reports carefully on the table and stood. I want you to stop treating experience like a problem you can automate away, I replied. Silence settled across the conference room while machines hummed steadily below us through thick glass walls. You thought I maintained equipment, I continued softly. What I was really maintaining was stability. Nobody interrupted because deep down they all knew it was true now. Later that afternoon, I walked through the production floor one final time before leaving the plant under a consulting agreement instead of a company badge. Operators waved goodbye from the lines while forklifts moved through loading zones carrying shipments finally cleared for release. Near line 7, the younger technician stopped me before I reached the exit. "How did you always know when something was wrong before the system did?" he asked quietly. I looked back toward the machine stretching beneath endless fluorescent lights and listened to the steady rhythm echoing across the floor. Then I answered honestly, because I never stopped listening after everyone else got comfortable. Outside, cold Ohio wind swept across the parking lot while steam rose from the factory rooftop into the gray afternoon sky. Behind me, the plant kept running. Stable, balanced, alive. And for the first time in years, so was I.